Yeah, so a lot of the benefits of the ketogenic diet is that it really forces your body to liberate fat stores, to liberate the fatty acids, I should say, from fat stores. And in doing so, it essentially enhances your metabolism to burn more fat. And this has been shown experimentally in various studies that have been done. The one that comes to mind is Jeff Bolick's study at Ohio State University, kind of conducted at University of Connecticut. He's at Ohio State now. But he had elite level athletes that were adapted to a high carbohydrate sugar burning diet and that were performing at a very high level, and athletes that were performing at a similar level but had been following a low carb, high fat ketogenic diet. And if you look at O2 consumption and CO2 production, the respiratory quotient, you can determine what the body is using for fuel. And he was able to show very convincingly that if you're adapted to a ketogenic diet, that you're burning about at least 2 times the amount of fuel, of fat for energy. So the athletes had actually changed their metabolic physiology to use fat as an energy source. And that has tremendous advantages because in the context of an ultramarathon, if you have 2 guys, one carb adapted or sugar burning and one fat burning, and they start running, your sugar stores in the form of glycogen will run out after about 1,500 to 2,000 calories, your sure. Stores in your muscle and your liver. But if you're pulling off your fat stores for energy, you're sparing your glycogen in the liver and the muscles because you're preferentially using the fatty acids for fuel. And, even a lean person has 20 to 30,000 calories of fat for energy stored on their body. Wow. Because fat is very, very energy dense. It's got 9 calories per gram. And, even if you pinch the skin on your forearm, which is very thin, it's still a lot of fat because it's encapsulating your whole body. And then, in your lower back, on your butt, on your thighs, you have lots of fat on your body, even in a lean person or a person that looks lean. So that's really, from a practical standpoint, that's pretty huge. Yeah. And that's, so being fat adapted has a tremendous advantage as far as substrate utilization, as far as extending your performance. And that has, implications for, the old guy, the guy that's trying to lose fat. If he restricts his carbohydrates, it's naturally forcing your body to burn more fat for energy. Mm-hmm. And with carbohydrate restriction and adding more fat to your diet, that has a satiating effect on your brain. So it's kind of telling your brain it's not as hungry because you don't have the blood glucose fluctuations. So there, you have kind of a practical, maybe perspective of the diet.
Yeah, I understand, and I don't know if this is accurate, I just heard this, that LeBron James went to South Africa to work with someone on getting on the ketogenic diet. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I know probably Tim Noakes maybe would be, and Tim Noakes is a doctor, a physiologist that advanced this idea of what's called the central governor theory, that in exercise performance, the fuel flow to your brain will dictate the extent of your performance and perceived exertion, reaction time, motor recruitment. So if your brain is getting lots of energy in the form of ketones, which will be high even if you're in a fasted state, and even if you've run out of your stored sugar stores, your body's burning fat, so you have a steady flow of energy to your brain in the form of ketones, that would preserve your brain's energy. And that's extremely important for athletic performance because maintaining and preserving brain homeostasis maintains neurotransmitters. Like I mentioned, there's perception, your perceived exertion is less, your reaction time is faster, very important for a basketball, and your brain activates your muscles, right? So if your brain's functioning with a high energy fuel, it's sending signals to your muscles to contract. So you're faster, your reaction time's better. So these all can have tremendous implications for the athlete. And I think the one of the nutritionists is Kate Shanahan, and we had met a couple times. At least one time, I think we were at the Ancestral Health Symposium and sat next to each other and had a nice chat. And you know, she was working with a number of athletes and adapted them more away from a carbohydrate-based diet to a high-fat, low-carb diet that would put the athletes into ketosis, and they were performing better, and their body composition changes were impressive. So you know, LeBron James has been kind of in the media a lot with his shirt off.
Yeah, exactly. You touched on this. I kind of want to go into this a little bit more. When you're on ketosis, what effect does it have on appetite and calorie intake for a person in general?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think the effect of a ketogenic diet and ketones in particular on appetite contributes to what could be the main benefit of the diet, is that it suppresses your appetite. It doesn't, I think suppress is a wrong word. It controls your appetite, so your appetite's not controlling you, right? Okay. If you're on a high sugar diet, and I remember being on one, 10 years ago, and it doesn't have to be sugar. It could be like eating fish and rice. 2 or 3 hours later, I was getting hunger pangs. I was getting, cravings for bread, for carbohydrates, for a candy bar or something. When you're on a high-fat ketogenic diet, your blood glucose is very stable. Your insulin levels are very stable. And you don't have what's called the postprandial hypoglycemic dip. So after we eat, our insulin gets released, and from our pancreas, it's stimulated by the glucose that enters our bloodstream. And that insulin, and some people, what happens is that the insulin kind of disposes of a lot of glucose, and you get a hypoglycemic dip. Your blood sugar becomes low after you've eaten a lot of sugar, and that makes you crave sugar more. So you want to repeat that and do it over and over. It's a vicious cycle. And that's completely abolished or significantly attenuated if you're on a ketogenic diet. And you can look at people who wear a continuous blood monitor called the Dexcom. I have a student that's type 1 diabetic that has shifted from a carbohydrate-based diet to a ketogenic diet. And instead of his numbers going like this all day, his numbers do very little fluctuations all day, and his mind is sharper. It's much safer for him because he doesn't have very low lows or very high highs. And if your glucose is really high, that's essentially making your blood like sludge and impeding blood flow to your eyes. So if you're type 1 diabetic and your glucose is sky high, you could go blind. Sure. You could destroy your kidneys. So if you, I know it's a bit controversial, but if a type 1 diabetic was to go on a low-carb, high-fat diet, they would use considerably less insulin to manage. And whenever you're using less insulin to manage your type 1 diabetes, that's a good thing. So any doctor who says otherwise is not in his right mind. But doctors are not advocating the use of low-carb ketogenic diets for type 1 diabetes. They're starting to come a little bit on board, and there's even a book called The Ketogenic Diet for Type 1 Diabetes by a medical doctor who's a type 1 diabetic. But it's not embraced because people think eating this way is just so hard. But I don't find it hard personally, and most people who give it a chance won't find it very hard to do.
Yeah, I think kind of that's let's talk a little bit about the ketogenic diet, the modified ketogenic diet, and protein intake, since we're kind of on the subject of eating. So, what's your views on that?
That's a good question. So it's really important to remember that the ketogenic diet is a medical therapy, and it was developed originally at the Mayo Clinic, implemented at Johns Hopkins, and I think there's about 150 to 200 different centers in the United States that are linked with the Charlie Foundation, actually, that have dietitians that implement this. And it's supposed to be, you're supposed to weigh out your food, and it's very high in fat. In grams, you have, there's a 4-to-1, 3-to-1, 2-to-1. I don't want to get into discussing all the ratios, but essentially the clinical classic ketogenic diet is about 85 to 90% fat. And very low in protein, and people don't realize that. It's like 8 to 12% protein, and then the rest of it being, a very small amount of carbohydrates. So what has become popular over the years is the use of a modified ketogenic diet, or modified Atkins diet, it's also called. And that diet is about twice the amount of protein, which happens to be about equal to or less than the Western diet in protein. So it basically becomes an amount of protein that, is very comfortable and sufficient for an athlete. And it actually fits well into the diet from a practical standpoint if you're preparing meals. So a modified ketogenic diet is about 25% protein, I would say 20 to 30%, 25 with a little bit of wiggle room, and about 65% to 70% fat, with the balance, maybe 5 upwards to 10% being carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates would come primarily from green vegetables, leafy vegetables, cauliflower. I do a lot of cauliflower mashed potatoes.
Okay. Those are good.
It's actually a perfect ketogenic food. So, kale, spinach, asparagus, broccoli, cauliflower, all sorts of salads. Your fat can come from macadamia nut, is a perfect ketogenic food, avocado, olive oil, nuts. So these are all kind of foods that would be incorporated in high amounts in the modified ketogenic diet, whereas in a strict ketogenic diet, those foods that I mentioned would have to be limited. And from a modified ketogenic diet perspective, they're basically unlimited. And then you would fill in, your protein with fatty cuts of meat, chicken with the skin on it, a ribeye steak instead of like a lean steak, fatty cuts of pork, bacon, eggs.
I'm starting to get hungry as you're talking right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things because I've gotten on this just a little while ago, is using various sauces like hollandaise sauce, béarnaise sauce. I mean, that's egg yolks and butter, and it makes food taste great. I mean, it's actually to eat on a modified Atkins diet.
I'm glad you bring that up. Yeah, because these sauces are things that we were, traditionally taught to avoid, right? The gravy and things like that, and they become like a perfect way to further boost the ketogenic diet, to get your macronutrient ratios into that profile that helps you better maintain ketosis. And there's companies out there making what's called fat bombs. So they'll make these little cookies or little, I don't know what you'd call them, like little chocolate desserts, like little chocolate balls actually. And they're made from butter and maybe coconut and stevia instead of sugar or erythritol. And you eat it, and it is basically like 90 or 95% fat, and it tastes like a dessert. Obviously it's very filling and satiating because it's mostly fat. And if you could, it allows you to get more protein into your meals. And if you have these fat bombs during the day, your overall macronutrient ratio would fit into the ratios needed to keep in nutritional ketosis. So, and they taste good too. So these are things like over the last decade, the ketogenic diet has evolved in ways that allow for compliance. And that's the big thing. Like, no one's going to follow a diet if it's difficult to do. So there needs to be, so I think it opens up the window for many companies. I know Quest Nutrition launched what was called Quest Keto a few weeks ago. And if you go to the website, you could click on, not only do they have like a Reese's peanut butter cup and chocolate cups, but you can click on like a keto mousse or some kind of, beef stroganoff or salmon, and then they package it and send it right to your house.
Yeah.
So,
well, you have your own mousse that you've talked about.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your own mousse.
I like to source out my ingredients whole and kind of make things myself and experiment. There's different versions of it. Mm-hmm. So last night I had 2/3 of it was a coconut cream, and I buy Conchita brand coconut milk, and I pour off the coconut water and set that aside and use that for other things. And then I kind of take the cream and I put about 6 ounces into a bowl, and maybe 1 or 2 tablespoons of sour cream in there too. So it's basically a bowl of fat, and then I'll add some dark chocolate to it, baking chocolate, and 1 scoop of a plant-based, I'm experimenting now with a plant-based protein source. It's a protein isolate that's Dutch chocolate. And then I put like a teaspoon of cinnamon, some stevia, and then about 1/4 cup of wild blueberries that have like only about almost half the sugar, so that I source out. And that whole thing has actually a perfect ketogenic ratio. So it fits that ketogenic ratio, and I can indulge on that every night. And it's like the last meal before I go to bed. So I see the ketogenic diet as something that's kind of indulgent, because I really enjoy fatty foods. And I think I feel most people that follow the ketogenic diet and are true to it will feel better, will have more energy, and will just have kind of more stable mood and well-being, once they've adapted to it. Sometimes it takes, for some people, athletes actually bounce in and out of ketosis because of long-duration athletic events. Or if they're a cyclist and they're on their bike for 6 or 8 hours, they can't even take up enough sugar, to stay out of ketosis. So they adapt very quick. Most athletes adapt very quick, but the elite level athletes that follow a ketogenic diet, for them to get back to baseline and then perform better, it takes them about 3 upwards to 6 months sometimes.
Oh, really?
Because
okay.
you're changing. Well, if you look at the numbers, I think Jeff Volek and Finney published something years back that showed it took 6 weeks. But from a practical standpoint, from the athletes that I've communicated with, it really takes a little bit longer. And it may be because, there's a learning curve to learning the ketogenic diet. So it may have taken them a couple months to be following, a diet that really keeps them into ketosis. And if they're into ketosis, if they look at their numbers, they usually have a dip the first month or two, and then after about 3 months, they've come back to baseline, and then they start improving their numbers, and their stamina goes off the charts.
Wow.
So for elite level like performance athletes, so I get a lot of questions. Well, what about the strength athlete? What about the power lifter, the bodybuilder? I think ketogenic diets, modified ketogenic diets, are actually great for powerlifters and bodybuilders, especially if they're trying to lose weight or make a certain weight class. Mm-hmm. You can maintain your muscle and your strength going into trying to fit into a certain weight class. So I think they're extremely advantageous. We published an article with our Italian colleagues looking at elite level gymnasts, and their exercises were lots of dips and chin-ups and gymnastic type exercises, but they're able to increase or maintain their strength on a ketogenic diet, and they maintained all their strength and their muscle, but they lost more fat when they used the diet to do a body recomposition, we'll call it.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about exogenous ketones. Mm-hmm. And what is the benefit of using exogenous ketones? And my experience, I've been using exogenous ketones for about a month now. And the first thing I noticed was that I did not get a drop in energy in the afternoon, like at 2 or 3 o'clock, which was very common for me.
Yeah.
I slept a lot better. I had a lot more dreams. And also, I wasn't, my appetite, as you mentioned earlier, my appetite wasn't controlling me. I actually find myself not avoiding the calories, but not wanting the calories as much as I had in the past. So let's exogenous ketones. I think that's a really kind of interesting topic for everyone.
Yeah. I kind of prefer to run off a combination of endogenous and exogenous.
Okay.
But in being a fasted state, but only had taken ketones today, so I'm kind of running off exogenous ketones right now, and a little bit of my endogenous. What time is it? So I'm about 12 hours fasted or whatever, or more than that. So the benefits we're just finding out now. There's not a whole lot of research on this because they're actually new entities, new molecules. But what's important to recognize is that they are, when you consume them, they're bioidentical to what your body makes.
Okay.
So think of it as like creatine, right? So you take creatine, your body makes creatine, can derive it from its food sources, and can make it, but you're boosting it to kind of supraphysiological levels. And with exogenous ketones, you have the ability to adjust those levels to anywhere, and you have a commercially available meter that you can measure and look at your levels and find out where you feel the most energy, where your performance is optimized, and then you can drink your ketones or adjust your diet to get into that ideal, optimal zone. So that would be great. So what if a drug was like that? What if you could take a drug, anti-seizure drug or cancer drug or whatever, and be able to get a commercially available device and say you're in your optimal range? So I think that's pretty cool that this technology exists for exogenous ketones. So as far as applications, the original application for the first exogenous ketones that were out, well, there were some that were hypothesized or kind of suggested for a wide variety of metabolic disorders. But the main application for development and testing of exogenous ketones was warfighter performance. And that's how I stumbled upon it. So I would say athletic performance. There was a study that was published about a month and a half ago by Cox et al. In collaboration with NIH and Oxford that showed elite level cyclists had enhanced fat oxidation. They had lower levels of lactate production during exercise, and they had better time in their trials and cycling trials. So you have performance applications. The evidence suggested it was shifting body towards oxidizing fat for fuel, even though you were giving exogenous sources of energy, of ketones. And I think most importantly, the lower levels of lactate that was being produced, and it was about 50%, that's tremendous. So if an athlete can keep their lactate levels lower, they have less muscle burn, and you can extend athletic performance by suppressing that metabolite, which tends to impair muscle contraction. So it was lowering that. So that came out in Cell Metabolism, which is impact factor of a journal of like 17 or 18, which is pretty significant, and it was a pretty elegant study. And I knew that the work was being done over several years, so it's a lot of work. I actually wrote a review with my colleague Brandon Egan from Dublin, Ireland, that was published in the same journal just this week. It came out, and the title of that article is called "Fueling Performance: Ketones Enter the Mix." And it's a couple-page article, and it talks about that study, but it also talks about the effects on athletic performance may be due to the effects of ketones on the brain. So by enhancing your brain, if your brain's happy and energized, it can send signals to your muscle to contract faster with less with reaction times that are quicker. You get more motor units being contracted if your neurons are firing faster. Your perceived exertion is less because you're blocking some of the pathways. If your blood glucose is low, it's causing fatigue, and we call that central fatigue. And a lot of overtraining is really, not necessarily the muscles, but your central nervous system's ability to contract the muscles. And this is more or less the central governor theory. And I think there's a lot of merit to that theory, and we want to test this experimentally with the use of ketones. And I think what's also important is to do what's called metabolomic studies. And we're doing this in animals where we feed ketones, and we rapidly decapitate the animal at the end of the experiment, and we take the brain tissue and we look at all the different energy metabolites, and we show that the brain has essentially more neurotransmitters associated with sending signals to the muscle, and also greater levels of metabolites that are called the Krebs cycle metabolites. And this is kind of like the bioenergetic reserves of the brain, right? So the brain has these higher energy reserves, and it has more neurotransmitters, and that can be extrapolated to improve performance. So that would be like the first application, and the second application would be really what the ketogenic diet, the standard of care, what it's used for is epilepsy. And this, I'm really excited about this because this could change the whole, it could be a paradigm shift in treating seizure disorders and epilepsy. If the ketogenic diet has been underutilized because it's so hard to implement. You go to a doctor and he gives you a pill, and that's easy to do. And actually, patients have a hard time just taking a pill. So if you could develop some kind of shake that you drink that actually tastes good, you would be giving your body energy and controlling seizures and getting all sorts of health benefits. And we know that anti-seizure drugs have a host of side effects, including in kids, they cause developmental delays.
Sure.
So it can, ultimately decrease the IQ of the kids that are following it and have all sorts of developmental delays. So if we could mimic the ketogenic diet with ketone esters, I think that's kind of what I'm most excited about, is changing the world of epilepsy with this. And a lot of epileptologists will argue, well, the ketogenic diet works because it's restricting glucose, and it's not just the ketones. But a lot of the data that's emerging now is suggesting that the ketones themselves have anti-seizure effects. Ketones have anti-inflammatory effects, tremendous anti-inflammatory effects. And I think a lot of seizures that people are having, whether it be caused by febrile seizures are caused, or various viruses that cause neuroinflammation, like things like the herpes simplex virus. Before people get a cold sore outbreak, they'll get a headache, or shingles, and I have people that email me and they say, is the virus that I have in my body affecting my brain? Because I get these horrible headaches, and then a few days later I get shingles. And we know that these viruses cause neuroinflammation in the brain. And some people who have headaches, they'll have a seizure. Or some people have these various neuroinflammatory disorders. I guess a good example would be traumatic brain injury. It causes neuroinflammation. And if you've had a penetrating TBI, a penetrating traumatic brain injury, you're about 85 to 90% likely to have seizures. And those seizures, because you're disrupting brain energy metabolism, you are causing neuroinflammation that is undoubtedly contributing to the seizures. And the new data is showing you can actually use a PET scan technology and show that just preceding a seizure, people will have higher rates of neuroinflammation. And then when you have a seizure, you have greater levels of neuroinflammation, because seizures beget seizures, and it could be resulting in part due to this neuroinflammation, which the ketones could be targeting.